thank you so much to all. Thank you for attending this capacity building session, which we hope that will be of interest to you. First of all, I would like to remind you that this session is going to be recorded in order to be uploaded afterwards to the Transform YouTube channel. And also remember to keep your microphones turned off during the session, please. We have prepared the session to last approximately 1 hour and a half, divided between more or less 1 hour of presentations and of presentation and half an hour of questions and discussions. But maybe Louise will also raise some questions during the presentation. Well, for us, the timing of this session, we think that is quite appropriate, because in a certain sense, it is useful for the Catalan cluster to give you an introduction on citizen science prior to the project meeting in Barcelona. Obviously, to those of you who do not know citizen science in depth. In the project meeting, during the mutual learning session, you will have the opportunity to deepen in how we are concretely applying citizen science in Catalonia, but now we have the great experience of Louise to start talking and thinking and exchanging about that. And without further ado, let me introduce Louise Francis. She's one of the five members of the advisory board of Transform, and she's especially devoted to provide advice to the Catalan cluster due to her experience in citizen science. Louise Francis is a co-founder and managing director of the social enterprise Mapping for Change, which is part owned by University College of London. Her early research in mapping evolutionary genetics for environmental conservation led her exploring various dimensions, social, spatial, environmental, and technical, in her work and research, with a particular focus on just sustainabilities. Louise has led projects that embed participatory processes, stakeholder engagement, co-design, and citizen science to drive positive transformations at various scales. This spans topics from, for example, sustainable tourism and diversification in a small island states to local pollution monitoring and urban planning. And also from exploring issues of accessibility for people with mobility impairments to looking at citizenship and social housing issues, with a particular focus on marginalized groups. Her extensive experience includes working with a diverse range of stakeholders across the UK, Caribbean, mainland Europe, and sub-Saharan Africa. So I leave you the floor, Louise.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you for the invitation, and morning to everyone. And thanks for the introduction. Now, just to kind of give you a broad overview of what I'm going to cover today, and maybe depending on some input or feedback, some things I might go through a little bit quicker, but please, just use the chat if you've got questions and you want to ask anything, and we can just kind of progress. But I'll give you just a broad overview in terms of who we are as an organization, how we work, and then a kind of broad introduction to citizen science as a concept, and some basic kind of citizen science principles, and looking at citizen science in relation to policies and the different kind of typologies when people talk about citizen science. And then just give you a couple of kind of case study examples from the work that we've done over the last 12 years, with first looking at environmental monitoring and then looking at citizen social science. So as Diana kind of alluded to in her introduction, as an organization, we're very much about developing participatory methods with a particular focus on the spatial information in relation to citizen science, and using that as a way to kind of engage as many stakeholders as possible, depending on the context in terms of what we're working on, really with a focus on creating more resilient and sustainable communities. And just, one of the motivations for setting up the organization is what happens quite often when we're academics within academia, as we start research projects. which have a life cycle. And then after the life cycle, the project ends, the funding ends, and there's not always that kind of sustainability factor or the legacy. So as an organization, we're very much sitting on the kind of boundary between academia and applying things in practice in a real world sense to also provide that kind of legacy. So we co-design projects with citizens, very much with them as collaborators and more than just kind of being, you know, subjects in our research or data collectors. And we use maps as the main medium, because basically everything that we do, see, smell, hear, happens somewhere, and place is something that resonates with people on multiple levels. But I just wanted to, just in terms of where, and I think Deanna's already explained that, you know, we've got a variety, or we've undertaken a variety of projects at various scales, ranging from neighborhood estates to across a particular region, and sometimes internationally. So working on collaborative projects which have pilots running in multiple cities across the world. And again, ranging on topics from environmental justice, sustainability, air quality monitoring, just to name a few. But what I wanted to start really today is just to ask yourselves is, because obviously you're all coming from different areas of expertise, different, you know, areas of academia. So I kind of wanted to ask you kind of what comes to mind from your perspectives when you hear the term citizen science. Now I'm going to try and do this by myself. Oh, thank you, Hannah. Yes, normally we've got a team working together, but Hannah's joined. Thank you. So she's just stuck a link in the chat to a Menti poll, and there's just 2 questions there, and I'd really appreciate if you all could just take a couple of minutes and maybe just answer those 2 questions, because I'm just kind of interested to know what the starting point is in terms of your own understanding and experiences before we go forward. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes for you to actually use that Menti poll, and hopefully I'll be able to also, or with the help of Hannah, I'll be able to share the feedback from the poll in the next 2 slides. If anyone's got problem accessing the link, then please just, let us know, put your hands up, or we can share it again. Okay. So maybe, Hannah, we could take a screen dump of the answers that we've got for the first poll. And then I can share. Or maybe not. Doing things on the fly don't always work out. Okay, maybe I can do this myself. Let's see. Add it to do.
Refresh, Louise, you might.
Probably not might. There we go. No, of course I can't move this. There we go. There we go. Thank you. Thanks, Hannah. Right, so on average, we're looking at, we're in the kind of center 1.8 of you being almost in the median range. So quite a few of you are knowledgeable, but more of you are leaning to the kind of middle range in terms of your existing knowledge, which is good. So I don't feel like I'm preaching already to the converted. So that gives me a little bit of confidence there. And just when you're thinking about the term citizen science, these are the main kind of sentiments or words that spring to mind. Participation obviously being the largest, which is really good. Data collection, sharing ideas, publics, democracy, empowerment, scientific research, extraction, very interesting. That's one that could be explored, yes. There are definitely elements of an extractive approach. That's another kind of critique when it comes to citizen science. Collaboration, progress. Okay, so we're ranging from a quite broad plethora of concepts and thoughts in relation to that. One from one extreme looking at emancipation, and if we look at the other scale of the spectrum, we're looking at extraction. So hopefully I'm going to provide some examples which may be less extractive, although I do know they exist. But yeah, all right, thank you for that. I'm going to just now kind of move on and obviously just kind of introduce very kind of basic terms and concepts in relation to when we're talking about citizen science as a methodological approach or an area of research. So although citizen science is a relatively new term, the involvement of volunteers, particularly in environmental monitoring, is definitely not novel practice. But over the past decades, both with kind of technological advances, have led to a rapid increase in the ways in which volunteers can actually exist, particularly with data collection and analysis. And data collection is one aspect of involvement when we're looking at citizen science. But in its simplest term, when we're talking about citizen science, is really engaging non-professional scientists in the production of new knowledge or understanding. And that's not to say that, you know, we as academics cannot be participants in a citizen science project. It just might be in a field that we're not particularly familiar with, or that's not our area of expertise. And government departments and agencies now are regarding citizen science as a way to involve the public in the development of research, monitoring and evidence to inform policy. And there are a number of kind of different examples of projects ranging from kind of in the UK, we've got Defra's Tree Health and Biosecurity Action Plan. There's a national pollinator strategy, both calling for the training of volunteers to assist with monitoring. So put it simply, it's really just about engaging non-professionals. Now, I guess the impetus, or there are a number of kind of different areas and policies that actually support the use or the development of citizen science across a number of different domains. And if we look particularly at Principle 10 of the Rio Declaration, where it states that environmental issues are best handled with the participation of all concerned citizens at the relevant level. And it goes on to state that it should facilitate and encourage public awareness and participation by making information widely available. And Rio 10 also recognizes the importance of public participation in achieving sustainable development. Again, if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, we can see areas where citizen science can contribute to trying to reach some of these Sustainable Development Goals. And then if we go further, oh, sorry if I'm not on silent. If we go further and then look at the Aarhus Convention, which actually recalls Principle 10 in its preamble text, it's been characterized as one of the strongest manifestations of procedural environmental rights, which are deeply rooted in the right to live in a healthy environment. And if we just when we say procedural rights, these are the formal steps that are taken to actually enforcing legal rights. And in this case, it's the ability to participate in environmental decision-making. And in the revised recommendations for the Aarhus Convention, which was updated, it actually specifically states that citizen science falls within the range of information sources that should be used in monitoring and managing the environment. And with the rise of citizen science, we've also seen a number of kind of global citizen science associations emerging. We've got EXA, which is the European Citizen Science Association, along with the Australian, American, etc. And this is kind of helping to both kind of promote citizen science projects and programs, but also in developing areas of best practice. So EXA published, I think in 2012, the 10 principles of citizen science. And here, these principles are really looking to share best practices and build capacity around citizen science practitioners. And I can share some links. I can provide the presentation afterwards, and there'll be links to some of these documents that will be available for you to kind of look at in more depth. So just kind of thinking about traditional forms of knowledge creation and also policy making. Traditional science has always been the knowledge base to inform policy over the years, but the merits in engaging citizens in the design of policies via either consultative or participatory means to achieve accountability and transparency has widely been recognized. And now there are various tools and mechanisms to kind of facilitate this kind of public engagement, ranging from citizens' assemblies, public voting, and citizen forums, which are more kind of traditional forms. But a lot of these are quite top down. And there is a growing recognition that citizen science offers a new potential at the kind of science and society interface by drawing in participants at both a local and global scale that connects citizens and policy, and bringing also the kind of societal and economic as well as scientific and political benefits to inform policies. And Sven et al. Wrote a paper in 2021, which outlined how citizen science can contribute to policy making at various stages of the policy cycle, including the agenda setting right the way through to evaluation. So we can see how citizen science as an area can actually support to the development and initiating policies, as well as evaluating existing policies in terms of their progress. So when we talk about citizen science, all citizen science isn't equal, which is quite interesting, where one of the comments earlier on was extractive as a term being used, as a mode. Now, there are various kind of different typologies that have been expressed and communicated by various academics over the years. And this is one by a colleague and the co-founder of Mapping for Change, actually, Muki Hackley. And he looks at the kind of various typologies in terms of citizen engagement in relation to the levels of participation. And just to kind of go through these at the most basic level, in citizen science projects, participation is really limited to the provision of a resource. And that kind of cognitive engagement is really minimal or non-existent at all. So for example, if we think about volunteered computing, relies on participants that might just be engaged at this level. And this, a lot of crowdsourcing is kind of sits within this typology or this domain of citizen science. And when we look at participatory sensing, the implementation of similar level of engagement will have participants maybe asked to carry a sensor around and bring them back to the experiment organizers. The advantage of this type of approach from the perspective of scientific framing is that as long as the characteristics of the instrument, as in the sensor or a GPS receiver, in terms of its accuracy is known, there's some control over the experiments. And so some of the assumptions about the quality of the information can be used. And there are a number of kind of arguments or papers writing about citizen science data and data quality, and also the kind of gamification of data within citizen science. But I'm not kind of going to go into that at this stage. But at the same time, when you're running projects at this kind of crowdsourcing level, it means that even if people are really willing to engage in a scientific project, their most valuable input is really their cognitive ability, but it's not being utilized when you're really just kind of using citizens as sensors. The second level in terms of the typology that Muki's outlaid is what we call distributed intelligence. And this is where the cognitive ability of participants is the resource that's being used. So you've got large projects which are quite renowned and famous, such as Galaxy Zoo. And many of the kind of classic citizen science projects are working at this level, where participants are asked to actually undertake some basic training and then go on to collecting data to carry out a simple kind of interpretive activity. It might be trying to identify or do some species identification. And usually the training activities includes a test that provides researchers with an indication of the quality of work that a participant can kind of carry out. And with this type of engagement, there's a need to be aware of the questions that volunteers will raise whilst they're working on a project, and actually how to support their learning beyond this initial training stage. The next level is where we're talking about participative science. And this is where some people call it participative science, some people call it community science. And it's a level of participation in which defining the problem is actually set with the participants and in consultation with the scientists and experts. And then as a result, a data collection methodology is developed and devised. And here is where you see the participants are engaged in the data collection. They may require some assistance by the experts in analysing and interpreting the results, but they can also be involved in this kind of analysis process. And this method is much more kind of common in environmental justice cases and kind of goes toward Irwin's call to have science that matches the needs of citizens. But participatory science can occur in other types of projects and activities, especially when we're considering the volunteers who actually become experts in data collection analysis through their engagement. So in these kind of cases, you see participants can suggest new research questions which might emerge as a result of their involvement. And they can also be explored with the data that they've collected. And finally, you've got at this kind of top level is what we call collaborative science. And Muki kind of coined the term extreme citizen science to kind of characterize this typology. And this is really where we're talking about an integrated activity. And it's where, for example, in parts of astronomy, professionals and non-professional science are involved in deciding which specific problems they want to work on. And the nature of data collection, so it's also valid and answers the needs of scientific protocols while matching the motivations of those people that are actually interested in participating. And people can choose their level of engagement and can be potentially involved from the problem definition through to analysis and also publication and using the results moving forward. And this form, as I said, he terms extreme citizen science. Now, there are other typologies, and I'm not going to go into detail in relation to what they are, but this is just an example of a different typology developed by Shirk et al. The reference is just at the bottom of the slide there. And they divide theirs into 5 categories. And they're terming these five categories that exist within public participation in scientific research. And theirs is really based on the degree of participation. And the one thing I want to note in this classification is while it outlines a degree of participation, it's much more the attention is much more on the role of the project designers and the owners rather than the degree of participation. And just, I guess, for us as an organization, we've kind of enshrined some of these concepts and ideas in developing our own engagement methodology, which is very much enshrined in Principle 10 and the RS Convention with regards to access to information. And this kind of methodological approach has really been developed to enable us to flexibly work with communities in different contexts, with, focusing on anything from a social topic to an environmental topic. And this kind of process allows us to kind of co-create knowledge with communities on a wide range of issues. And I just want to kind of, before sharing some of the case studies with you, I wanted to highlight some of the kind of critical considerations that need to be made when designing a citizen science research project, and particularly when we're using technology as a tool within the process. And that is that we really need to think about what's the broader context, what are the drivers, both political, economical, that are actually going to influence the research that's being undertaken. And then within this, what is the social context and how will that influence the design and development of the tools and instruments that we're going to use? Does everybody have access to the same technology? How do we tackle issues of literacy? And it's only when we start to ask ourselves these questions and try to find answers to those questions, can we then start to design a citizen science project which meets these broader but also more local contextualized needs. And then thinking about what are the appropriate tools and technologies that enable us to capture and map both quantitative and qualitative aspects to aid our research. So it's really thinking about how we integrate technology. And when I say technology, to me, pencils and paper are also a technology, as much as a mobile phone application is a technology. How do we integrate them into a social process that takes account of this broader and also local context? Now, I just want to share with you a couple of case studies, or a few case studies that we've worked on over the years. And these start within the domain of citizen science in relation to environmental monitoring. And in the 3 decades since the emergence of the term citizen science, much of the literature has been dedicated to research within the natural sciences. And there are many scientific endeavors within the domains of environmental, physical, astronomy, and biological science. So it's been strongly adopted within this particular domain for a number of different reasons. And if I just take air quality as one example, existing kind of policies and air quality monitoring, which is undertaken as a legal requirement by municipalities across Europe and in other locations, relies on high-grade static sensors to provide real-time continuous monitoring. But the facts are these are very costly and expensive, and their distribution in terms of geographical distribution are sparse. So as a result, a lot of data or a lot of measurements in relation to air pollution are inferred by generating models, because we have gaps in the data. So we don't actually know what the air quality is like in a number of situations or a number of locations. So there's a sparsity of real-time hard data, and we have to use models to actually understand or infer what the air quality is like in specific locations. Now, over the last 15 years, there's been like a whole explosion of low-cost, low-grade sensors that have been developed. But there are issues in relation to data quality with some of those low-grade sensors. So yes, they afford us the ability to have a kind of distributed network in terms of monitoring, but there are questions in relation to the quality of data that those instruments provide. So I'm just going to give you a story of 2 cities, basically, where we undertook a very similar methodological approach, but in completely different contexts. And one is in Kampala. Kampala is the capital city of Uganda. It's one of the fastest growing African cities. It has an annual growth rate of 5.6% and a population of around 3 million. That population nearly doubles in size daily, just with this diurnal migration of people migrating into the capital city for work, school, or what have you. And you have to put this into a context in relation to the infrastructure for this city was actually developed for a population of 150,000. So it was designed for a population of 150,000. Currently it houses 3 million, and that doubles on a daily basis. So this kind of rapid urban growth causes major socioeconomic, but also environmental problems. And air pollution is one of those. In contrast, we have another capital city. This is the heart of London. So the City of London, for anyone that's visited, is basically the kind of primary central business for London. It has an estimated 1 million kind of workforce migrating to the centre of London on a daily basis, but the actual resident population is only around 9,000. So it's one of the smallest kind of resident populations of cities across London. And the residents that live in this area actually has the lowest kind of car ownership of areas across, you know, cities across both the UK, not just London itself. So a small resident population, but a daily kind of wave of people migrating on a daily basis, but the actual car ownership is small, even though there's a lot of cars that travel through the centre of London on a daily basis. So we undertook citizen science projects in each of these cities, but the starting point and the stakeholders involved were quite different in these two cities, and the contexts were very different. So in the Barbican, which is the centre of London, the residents there were partially informed, so there was a certain degree of awareness in relation to air pollution and air quality. They had access to some information which was provided by the local authority. And there was also social capital and capacity to a degree, but still maybe not necessarily this empowered or this ability to influence decisions. On the other extreme, you've got Kampala, where you have little to no information. So there was only one existing kind of official monitoring station in the whole of the city, and that was within the US embassies, outside the US embassy. So they had no data on air quality, but also a lack of resources and capacity in relation to generating or collecting air quality data. So quite two different extremes. But the stakeholders that were involved in Kampala were very much central to decision making. So these were the environmental officers within the Environment Agency and also members of the City Council. But we also elected to engage the schools as part of a broader awareness raising programme. So the starting point in Kampala was to really look at where would they want to, or where would be important for them to actually collect air quality data. So they divided the districts and looked at potential monitoring sites based on their kind of local knowledge on traffic, different industrial zones, commercial areas, and also areas in relation to schools. Conversely, when we started to engage the residents in the centre of London, the community there said, look, we live here, we know the area, and we know that there are hotspots and there are areas of concern, irrespective of where the City of London currently monitors. And we want to collect information in relation to those hotspots that we're aware of to actually really understand what the air quality levels are like in those locations. So we used our mapping platform for them to actually share where they'd like to monitor and see measurements set up over a period of time. So in each location, we trained, whether it be school children, teachers, members of the Environment Agency, the City Council. In the Barbican, it was residents and different members of the community to actually use what we call a diffusion tube, which measures nitrogen dioxide. And this is a small passive monitor, but it's also an instrument that's used by local authorities across the UK. And the reason that we use that device is, one, it's cheap and affordable. It's easy to deploy, but also because it's a device that's used by local authorities, that information can be compared with data that's being collected by local authorities. So it can be directly comparable. And in Kampala, the program was much broader in relation to raising awareness. And we developed a schools toolkit, which had lesson plans and different science experiments and resources and materials for them and gave teachers basic training in relation to air quality and also how to raise awareness about the topic, and also the deployment of monitoring stations around schools. And they also had an inter-schools competition to think about mitigation measures and awareness raising campaigns that they could deploy. In the centre of London, it was much more resident-led and resident-based. And there, what the residents decided to do is kind of go out and speak to some of the key sources of, or perceived key sources of pollution in the area, namely idling vehicles and taxis, but also thinking about other areas in terms of greening up and how they could use plants and planting as a way to mitigate their exposures to air pollution. So the result in the Barbican was actually a years-long study. And why it was important to do a years-long study in the Barbican was when we're looking at the EU legal limits in relation to nitrogen dioxide, they specify an annual mean. So again, to be able to understand what the measures were like in that locality, we also wanted to be able to calculate annual means. So over the course of 12 months, in over, I think, 60 or 70 different locations across the Barbican estate, they were able to collect an annual data set for nitrogen dioxide. In Kampala, the case was we did a 6-month study, and they were able to set up a monitoring network in, I think it was around 92 sites, both outside of schools and those designated by the Environment Agency and the local authority to collect data that they'd never been able to collect before. And just looking at the kind of outcomes, and I think sometimes when we initiate these citizen science projects, of course, as academics, for us, we're interested in the research side of things, but for us, it's very important to have tangible outcomes that can have an impact on a longer scale. And here, in relation to the Barbican, not only was there this increased awareness and understanding about air quality in the area, in locations that they hadn't had before, they used this data to actually start to influence the air quality strategy developed by the local authority. And as a result of that, there were a number of specific measures that were introduced. And some of those, I think I've just maybe pressed something that I shouldn't have. Can you still see my screen? Has it disappeared? Okay, sorry.
No.
Windows, too many windows open. So some of the measures that they introduced were actually looking, so the residents came up with their own wish list, and on the back of the wish list that the residents came up, the local authority selected to adopt and introduce a number of measures. And that ranged from kind of softer things like installing electric charging points, initiating a cargo bike delivery service, having anti-idling action days. But some of the larger kind of policies and trials that they implement was actually to initiate a low emission neighborhood. So a designated zone around the area where certain vehicles emitting with certain emissions were just prohibited. And then they also piloted a zero emission street. So it wasn't just about the process of raising awareness and collecting data. There were tangible outcomes as a result of that project. And actually what we've been able to do, or we've been asked to do 6 years on, and this is something that's still ongoing, we're actually coming to the last month of monitoring, is to go back and repeat this piece of research. So 6 years later, having introduced all of these policies and measures, the City Corporation of London have asked us to carry out the same citizen science project to look at the impact that those measures have had over the last 6 years. So we've initiated this and we started last year. And as I said, we're just coming to the end. This is just a snapshot of the first 6 months of monitoring to compare the 2014 results with those of 2021. And this is really an opportunity not only to use this process as a way to engage the local residents in the research, but actually to measure and monitor the impact that these policies have at a local scale. And just to share with you some of the outcomes and the results from the research that was undertaken in Kampala, that project, obviously, air quality was very much, or looking at air pollution was very much in its embryonic stage in Kampala. So what we were able to do is collect a whole new data set which just did not exist anymore, which then formed the basis of setting up a systematic and permanent monitoring network, which with the capacity building that was developed with the Environment Agency and also the local authority, they were able to then continue. And this also fed into the first ever draft of air quality regulations that the country had basically ever had. And just in terms of the engaging the schools, I mean, there were, I think, over 100 kids involved. There was very much this kind of heightened awareness of air pollution and the impacts and some of the mitigation strategies that people could try to deploy in relation to trying to reduce their exposure. So we've done a lot of work around air quality, both kind of at a local authority scale, at a city scale. And Hannah, who's probably in the background somewhere, is actually running this Planting Healthy Air School program, which again is very much around raising awareness of air pollution, but very much focused on the school infrastructure or the school kind of external infrastructure, namely playgrounds and places where kids spend a lot of their time. And it's about identifying with the kids and the parents areas that they want to undertake monitoring and collect data, and then using that to actually think about where they could implement greening, green screens and other green infrastructure to try to reduce their exposure. And this is a rolling program and they've worked in a number of schools, but this is also leading to kind of a broader engagement, not only with the pupils and the teachers, but also the parents. So in one of the schools, you know, one of the parents was really kind of shocked by the data that was coming through. So not only did the kids design posters for kind of anti-idling to increase the parents to kind of switch their engines off outside of school, but they also encouraged the local authority to set up a static and permanent monitoring station outside of their school because the levels were so high. And in another school, one of the kind of waiting points to pick up and drop off kids has actually been shifted because of the results and the information and the knowledge that was generated through this process. So again, it's about creating this new knowledge, but then using this knowledge to inform change. And whatever we do or wherever we work, we really try to think about approaches that can be replicated elsewhere. So we're using a mapping platform that can be replicated and used in different languages, in different countries, in different contexts, and also methodologies and, you know, low-tech instruments that can be deployed. And this is just an example here from Barcelona, where the same methodology, same citizen science approach was deployed by colleagues, Josep already, so some of you probably know Josep, and he used this to undertake the kind of broadest or the biggest kind of citizen science air quality monitoring project in Barcelona to date, with 20 schools in engaging over 1,500 kids in 8 different locations. So again, it's about being able to scale and replicate these kind of citizen science approaches and methods. And this has been done not only in relation to air quality, but also in relation to noise. And noise is very similar to air quality when we're talking about environmental monitoring, in that you need to use high-grade static sensors to provide real-time continuous monitoring. And in the same way that air pollution has to be modeled to understand and infer the levels of pollution that people are exposed to, the same occurs when we're looking at noise pollution. So basically, you get strategic noise maps that are developed, and this is based on transport network or around large agglomerates, large cities. But this completely ignores the cumulative exposure that we have when we're living anywhere. So you might be exposed to road traffic, trains, a noisy neighbor playing music, dogs barking, airplanes. This is cumulative. We don't isolate a particular sound and say, okay, I'm only exposed to this level of noise because that's the source. And the fact is that there are, in a number of locations, communities are negatively impacted by noise pollution from a variety of different sources. And in this case, this was a community in London who were negatively being impacted by noise coming from this scrapyard. So yes, recycling vehicles and metals could be deemed good from a kind of environmental perspective, but the impact that that was having on the local community in terms of being exposed to excessive noise pollution was negative. And they'd been individually kind of complaining about this noise issue for a number of years. And this is an example of a citizen science project where the community themselves kind of mobilized and identified the problem and sought for assistance and help to try to generate an evidence base to show what it is that they were trying to say or had been dismissed as anecdotal previously. So we designed a methodological approach to enable them, giving them low-grade handheld sensors, and asked them to take measurements morning, evening, night in triplicate, so as to kind of at least have a bit of a systematic approach to the data collection. And this generated a kind of noise map over a kind of gridded area around the estate. And this was the kind of first noise map that had been created for that particular area. And what the residents did was to use that map and the data that they gathered over a few months to have a sit-down meeting with the local authority and the Environment Agency to say the things that we've been trying to communicate with you over the last 4 or 5 years, here is an evidence base. This is the method that we deployed. This is what we did. And here we're trying to communicate to you, this is what we are being exposed to and experiencing on a regular basis. And that was the first time that the kind of ears of the local authority and the Environment Agency picked up. And actually what they did on the back of that was to appoint trained acousticians to carry out a detailed analysis of noise in and from the scrapyard. And as a result, funnily enough, the findings from the trained acoustic consultants was not dissimilar to the data that was gathered by the citizens through this method and through this approach. And on the back of that, the license for the scrapyard was actually revoked. So again, it's using this program to generate research and new knowledge and trying to use that to inform decision makings. And in the case of peaks, we use handheld noise meters. In other locations, we've used smartphones. Yes, there are issues with regards to the kind of hardware when you're using using smartphones to collect noise readings. But actually in this example, we explained the limitations with regards to thinking about, decibels when you're using a mobile phone app. This was more about demonstrating the effect, the kind of qualitative aspect of being exposed to noise. And this was around looking at Heathrow Airport, particularly in line with the fact that Heathrow Airport had a planned kind of third runway, an expansion. There was a large consultation going on around that. So they collected over 6,000 noise readings over a period of 12 months. And actually the kind of upshot was that information was actually fed into a response to the Davies Commission, which was a much broader report and consultation in relation to the development and expansion of Heathrow. And I think from the residents' perspective and also the local authorities, is the whole research process really just legitimized the concerns of local residents regarding noise, and also kind of highlighted the importance of taking into account this community experience and the impact that aviation has on residents. Did it stop has it stopped the potential of the Heathrow expansion? Probably not, but it's been able to be used as a mechanism to give those residents a voice. I'm just conscious of time here, so I'm going to give one last example and then maybe open up the floor to some questions. Last is in relation to, this is environmental monitoring, and this is around looking at odor pollution, which again has issues in relation to the traditional way of monitoring odors. And one of those key limitations is not only the fact that it's expensive, is it doesn't give information about impact of odor nuisance on those people living in areas where they're exposed to odor pollution. So we worked as part of the DNOS's project in one particular location where the community were really crying out for the fact that they were being negatively impacted by odor by a number of different industries in the area, but particularly from a gasworks. So basically there was an old gasworks site, and this was now being transferred and regenerated to develop housing. But as a result of that, there was a lot of soil remediation works, and there were real concerns from the community in relation to pollution coming from those soil remediation works, and also the odors being generated from the exercise in question. So what we wanted to do is say, can we design and develop a process to generate an evidence base to look at the impact that this might be having on the local community? So we identified through the stakeholder mapping several odor emitting industries in the area, and also try to have conversations with these actors, both the industries, the local authority and the local residents, to design an approach which would support the interests of all concerned. So again, when I spoke earlier on and thinking about designing the approach and in relation to the local context, there's a very high Punjabi resident population, not all necessarily having mobile phones. So we had to use different mediums to both communicate and engage with the local residents. So social media being one, but this is one of the kind of cash campaigners who actually went out providing leaflets to residents in the area. And what they did over a period of 12 months was actually to generate and collect odor observations throughout that period of any time that they either was an odor episode, but we also encouraged them to collect information when there were no odor episodes. And the motivation behind that was because the local authority were afraid that people would just use this as a means to report irrespective of there being odor. So sometimes null readings are as valid as a reading. And over the period of time, I think there were something in the region of 500 plus observations made by over 50 residents. So I'm not going to go into detail in terms of the breakdown of the results, but just to say that through this process, there were certain days where the data kind of showed that there was in excess of odor, and using that information and feeding it back to the industries and the local authority, we could start to look at what activities are going on specific days that might be negatively impacting the community. So on one particular day, it was identified when we shared the information that road was being laid down and asphalt was being laid down in the housing development. So as a result, that's why we saw an increase in the number of observations being made. So again, it's about using the information and data to try to inform, and then thinking about ways that we can they could either mitigate or pre-warn residents of potential odor episodes. And finally, really the kind of upshot of this, initiating this process, was the local authority decided to actually incorporate the Odor Collect app, which was the main tool that was developed for the project, as part of their environmental reporting procedure, because traditionally their environmental reporting had been done by phone, and people were reporting that they would stay online for 45 minutes and not actually get through. So this was a new novel way to actually supplement and enhance their existing environmental reporting policy. And on the back of that, they also decided to employ a new environmental officer specifically to tackle odor in the particular geography within which the concerns had been raised. So it actually contributed to designing and developing new kind of policies and new ways of working for the environmental authorities, and the industries involved have also elected to share information and receive email notifications on the hour when new observations are being made, so that they can be much more reactive in relation to their response over time. Now, it's 11 o'clock and I don't want to be the only one that's talking, so I'm going to skip my last few slides and just kind of summarize to say that, you know, there is a growing acknowledgement that citizen science offers an opportunity, and I say offers an opportunity, that doesn't necessarily mean it always does, to provide new pathways for knowledge creation, and also to engage a broader public in policy discourses and decision-making processes. But we as researchers or practitioners, or those designing and developing citizen science programs, need to ensure that our methodological approaches are not only inclusive, but are situated within the broader political economic context within which we are developing programs. And they need to be designed understanding the kind of social and cultural norms and realms within which they'll operate. So these are things that we really need to be thinking about in designing and developing citizen science research and projects. And I will say thank you, and I will leave it there and say over to you if you've got any questions.
So thank you so much, Louise, for this great presentation. I think it was very interesting and very great examples about the work you do, and how can citizen science has the potential to not only make visible social and environmental issues, but also to promote the development of concrete public policies to tackle these problems, and also have a specific real impact in people's lives. So thank you very much. Now, please, if anyone has any question or topic that they would like to talk about, this is the time to open up the floor for discussion. You don't need to raise your hand. Yes, make it a little bit informal, an informal conversation. Angela, yes, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Louise, for this wonderful presentation to illustrate the potential of citizen science to inform policymaking. As you know, Transform is intended to use all the methodology that we are planning, are really implementing in our 3 cluster, not for the sake of providing some results in terms of citizen engagement, but because we really would like to test somehow how these 3 methodologies can really inform the process of policymaking. And I think that your example really highlighted well that citizen science can initiate the process of policymaking. So starting from some data and results can really ignite the process of having specific policies to respond to a sort of local societal challenge, but can be a tool also to monitor the impact of the grounding of the policy resulting from the work done thanks to citizen science and data collection together with communities. So I think this is really inspiring also for our regional professional colleagues in the project, not only the colleagues from Catalonia that of course are really working on this, but also the other two regions, so to know what is the potential of citizen science in this. I would like to focus a little bit on the extraction, because of course was really was quite weird the first at first sight to see extraction, but there is a lot of discussion and also critiques around the idea of using citizens and so to extract their time, energy, commitment to do something, so to really exploit their commitment. So in terms of using citizen science in the policymaking process, perhaps they can see some tangible result of their engagement in this process. But I would like to know from you, and starting from your experience, how we really can ensure that all this process is not just a matter of extraction or exploitation of the willingness and commitment of citizens, but it's a genuine community-driven process in which citizens can see a result and can share the sense of ownership of this process. There are some recommendations, rules, or principles that would be useful to apply to ensure that it is not an extraction exercise.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of topical area, and I think, you know, a lot depends on the starting point, and you know, sometimes that starting point is that there's a research funded project which has, you know, been designated or designed to deploy citizen science for a particular reason, and how that's framed. And also, you know, there are a number of calls right now which are asking for the use of citizen science, and I'm seeing that more and more, and how people imagine, coming from a range of different kind of domains, that should be deployed. This doesn't necessarily, it's quite top down in its thinking and its approach, and yes, quite often it is extractive. And I think, you know, one of the things is always about framing. How do we frame the broader, you know, challenges that we're trying to address with research in a way that resonates and has meaning to those people that we're wanting to engage. And although it kind of may sound negative, centering things around an issue, I think, tends to mobilize people, because issues resonate with people on various levels, and they can connect to these at various scales. So if we think about, 15 years of discourse around kind of climate change hasn't necessarily yielded the results that we would have hoped. But then when you center the discourse around an issue such as plastic, and then you show pictures of plastic and, on our shores, in our watercourses, that issue tends to resonate with people in a much more, connected, meaningful way. And I think that quite often it's about trying to understand what the issues may be from the individual to the local, and how that might be connected to bigger, broader issues, and using that to frame the problem. And then thinking about, okay, we're wanting to engage various people, but how might you want to participate? And what would be your motivations or even barriers to participate? And then thinking about these in the designing the kind of methodological approach, because again, we make so many assumptions. Everybody makes the assumption that mobile phones are ubiquitous and that everybody has a mobile phone. They don't all have mobile phones. Everyone has a smartphone. We don't. Or, my dad has a smartphone, but the only smartness in the phone for him is being able to call me. All of the other functionality within the phone, he doesn't use it. Again, assuming that everyone has mobile data plans, which are just limitless. People do pay as you go, and it's like they top up according to their needs or their financial situations. So again, I think we also need to be mindful in our research and our approaches is, who are we when we say citizens? Even the term citizen is also another kind of contentious issue, because, does that mean that if you are not legally a citizen, you then can't participate in citizen science? Or is it actually even using the term citizen, being inclusive? That's a whole nother debate. But I think we need to be mindful of, the approaches that we use, which can exclude people just by sheer design. So I think if we consider some of these different aspects, we can be less extractive, and actually design ways in which to have multiple benefits. So for the Barbican, as an example, the benefits is they've got green infrastructure, which is limiting the introduction of green infrastructure, which is then limiting their exposure. They have knowledge of where places are more polluted versus others, so that can help inform the routes that they take. The local authority has data which they can use to actually serve as an evidence base to introduce policies which are far more likely to be acceptable by the local populace because of this involvement. So again, it's about kind of the design and the framing in a way which thinks about all of these considerations, and tries to come up with an approach which can have dual purposes and benefits, and not just for me as an academic who wants to, produce another paper and have a big data set.
Thanks a lot, Louise. I think that there is a delicate balance between the top-down approach, but also how to institutionalize these processes, because we reflect upon this and transform so much, because of course our effort is to insert also on a long-term basis this methodology. And as you have presented, it's quite a result to have a new officer leading all this process. And so really using citizen science as a source to produce better policies for the common goods. So if we mean top-down, so to really start a process, not take into account the societal, cultural realms that you mentioned, yeah, of course, this is not the way. But if we think about top-down in terms of initiating the process from the institution, I think this is definitely the objective that we really would like to achieve in this kind of exercises. So we really need to find the balance between a top-down in terms of institutionalization, but to let citizens drive the process in terms of spot the issues and the problems that really would like to be addressed by the institution together with the citizens and the local communities.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree that there is a need to institutionalize these approaches, both when we're looking at, within the policy making arena. So if we're looking at how that might be done in depends on obviously the different areas within local authorities and also within higher education institutes, which is starting to happen, but again, it's not across the board. And I think the more that we can do that, the more we provide an environment that can facilitate these processes, and they can be more normalized in everyday practice. So, traditionally, I mean, we are moving in a better direction, but, within municipalities, the consultation was very much, a standard approach, and that you'd have 1 or 2 or 3 norms, some of them which could be considered tokenistic. But again, if we can start to institutionalize citizen science within, for example, municipalities as a practice which is more flexible and more inclusive, and actually can also be used as a kind of an opening for this bottom-up co-design of even service delivery, and thinking about better service delivery and collaborative service delivery from anything from healthcare to, other areas. I think we kind of strengthen both the capacity, know-how, and institutions and processes in a much more kind of streamlined way. So I'm in a definite agreement with it from that perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you, both of you. I think Roger raised his hand.
Yeah, if I can chip in. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really a lot to think about. And I think you solved the puzzle for me, actually, in the sense that I heard Alan Irwin reflect some years ago about what he saw as a kind of paradox, that you could have citizen science initiatives that at the beginning were rather extractive and top-down, and then they sort of gained a life on their own and became something else, and became a vehicle for empowerment and emancipation in the local community. And for him, it was a kind of paradox. I think that your analysis actually explains why. Because one thing is the methodological approach, but you emphasized, the level of situatedness within the broader political context and the understanding of the political realm in that place. So perhaps sometimes, thinking of that balance that also Angela is addressing, but I mean, that balance is also normally, there will have to be some element of compromise, I think, between institutional cultures and norms up there and down there, as it were. But in a way, makes me optimistic, because if we can just sort of start something, even as a Trojan horse, if that understanding is there and if the situatedness is there and it sort of resonates with issues that spark publics into being, it can just roll by itself. I don't know if this is also, I think your examples also show this actually.
Yeah, I mean, quite often we've started in, with one thought or idea in mind, because that's maybe where the research has been initiated or even the proposal design, and ended up in quite a different place. The sad point is, and you will all be able to attest to this, is, you write a research proposal, you wait a year to get an answer, and then you wait another 6 months to start, and then you wait another year to work out what the hell is it that we said we're going to do. And then by that, everything's changed and it's just not the same. But you've got to write a deliverable about this because that's what you said you'd do. And that, so sometimes it's those external constraints that actually do not enable this kind of organic evolution of processes in real time as they happen. So on occasion, we've been fortunate enough to be in a position where we've just said, sod it, we're going in this direction because this is where it's going and this is where the momentum and where people are wanting to mobilize to, and we'll just deal with the rest and try to cover up and justify later on down the line. And I think that really, of course, we understand, you need a framework and you need, a starting point, but I think we need more to enable more fluidity and flexibility in the design of research that's undertaken so that it can kind of tread this intricate balance. Even when you're dealing at, within the public sector, you have elections, and all of these things send things into flux and have an influence. And this is the real world, and this is how things happen. So I think, it would be nice for those kind of, funding frameworks and instruments that are provided to enable us to be much more fluid and flexible in our approaches to facilitate these processes.
Thank you very much.
Hi Louise. It's really nice to very interesting to hear to this presentation. I had just a curiosity because one of the examples you mentioned, if I understood correctly, was about this. I don't remember the exact word in English, but it's like a dump, like a landfill, but where they dismantle things. What was the word that you used?
The gas remediation works, or the scrapyard.
The scrapyard, yes, thanks. That was the word. That was really interesting because this is a big issue also in Belgium. There has been not so long ago a TV, these TV shows that they are kind of inquisitive and they go and like a report on issue, and it's one of the few topics on which there has been a very spontaneous citizen science initiative. So there are lots of towns and neighborhoods around this type of sites that suffer very much from different, it can be noise, it can be pollution, it can be lots of things. And actually the TV, so it's the, I don't remember if it's the public channels or if it's a private one, but they actually, so citizens have been asking for long to set up citizen science initiatives to be able to better prove that there are issues around these sites. And then in the end, the TV, so the journalists who ran this reportage they paid for this for a citizen science project that actually helped to collect some data. So they analyzed the hair of the people living not so far from these sites, and they could clearly see that there was a huge pollution issue there. There was a school nearby, and I mean, it's really interesting. It's in French, but I can share with you if you're interested. But what I found really interesting is that, if I understood correctly, you mentioned that then this site in the end they closed down. So I was just curious to hear how to learn from you how you deal with this kind of situation, because I can imagine that on one side you have, of course, all these issues that come from this they're dangerous, they are noisy, they are polluting. Sometimes they are located in areas where maybe some time ago there were not people living around, but now they are very much lots of people living there. But then I guess there is also the other side of it, that is, of course, maybe this effect of this place closing down, like making people lose jobs, or it's going to move somewhere else anyway. So where is it going to go to? So I was really curious, because it's the first time I hear that it leads to the site closing down. So I was just curious to know more how you handle the whole situation.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we didn't go and stand outside the scrapyard and say, yeah, it's our fault. We didn't.
No, I'm sure you didn't. I was just curious too.
But I mean, it was kind of breaching the rules of the license, within which it, every so often they have to review the license, and the license has to be adhered to based on certain criteria and conditions. And they just hadn't been able to have any evidence base or even motivate the Environment Agency to actually explore and undertake an assessment to see if it was adhering to its licensing. And as you said, it's very similar, I guess, in a lot of cities that are growing, is areas which were maybe more industrial or didn't have such a larger, resident population, are becoming more residential in nature. So this is also when we're looking at planning regulations and zoning, and actually redistributing, industrial areas and residential areas, is increasingly, being a requirement. So, yeah, I mean, it was a success, to be honest, from the perspective of the residents, and also not only noise, as you said. They then went on, after doing the noise study, to actually do a air pollution study, because of the concerns even of the breakup of kind of, small metal particles by the kind of machination and breaking up of vehicles in the area. So in that sense, it just seemed right for a relocation, rather than it to remain within this residential area very close to a school. People, it's far easier for a business to move than people, 3,000 people to move home.
Yeah, no, I can totally understand. It's really interesting. Maybe I can share with you a bit about it's going on in Belgium, because it's a big issue also, because being a small country, they struggle a lot with, wherever they move these sites, there's going to be, in the end, if not people living there, there's going to be farming, or so it's a big now it was this big scandal from this TV program, of course, now that helped to attract attention to the issue. And of course there is a lot of mishandling. They often don't respect the limitations that are imposed, but then of course they kind of hide this. So anyway, it's a really interesting example. Yeah.
And there's also this kind of dichotomy, as in, we are consumers, we buy vehicles, they need to be disposed of, this whole recycling. So again, there's two steps before the need for, we're talking about odor and, looking at waste needs to be disposed of, these things. So, there's more, I guess, factors to consider. This is the kind of artifact in relation to human activities and things that we do. Yeah, so sometimes the question is also thinking about how do we actually address certain issues prior to that lead us to, you know, the need for a lot of these industries.
Yeah, no, that for once I think if anyone is interested, I can share a link. But I thought the TV program was that dealt with this was well done, because they started the whole thing by saying, I mean, these sites are supposed to be doing something good. So of course we are pushing a lot towards circular economies, recycling, reusing. So in a way, I mean, they really went through the different steps. I thought it was quite well done, because of course they play a lot around this narrative, no, of them contributing to something good for society, etc. But in the end, yeah, so it's really interesting. Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much for sharing.
Thank you, Marcia. Well, it's 12:30. Yes, I think the time has come to close the session. I hope you found it interesting and useful, and I'm sure we will have much more time to talk and debate during the next project meeting. Thank you so much, Louise, for the great presentation. I don't know if Lucia, we will send the presentation. I don't know if me or you, we will send the presentation of the capacity building session.
For me, also me?
No, Louise, I was talking to Lucia, or we wait while the recording is uploaded to the YouTube channel.
When you have the recording, you can send me everything, and then I will upload it on our website and our YouTube channel.
Okay, thank you so much. So I hope we see each other in May again in presence. And thank you so much to all. Bye bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have the rest of the week.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.